My purpose in this paper is to show how some central issues in the philosophy of music have interesting applications beyond aesthetics. In particular, I aim to use debates about the nature of music as an art to throw light on a problem about music in the worship of God. To do that, however, I must begin by setting out what I take that problem to be. Plato's short dialogue Euthyphro is generally thought important for a dilemma that it poses regarding the relation between religion and ethics. Is an action good because it pleases the gods, or does it please the gods because it's good? This is the issue that forms the centerpiece of the exchange between Socrates and his interlocutor Euthyphro, but in fact the dialogue falls into three distinct parts. The first part effectively shows that the multiplicity of gods is irrelevant to the question, which is why Plato's dilemma is usually expressed in terms of God and good. The third and possibly least discussed part raises a question about the intelligibility of worship. How could human beings ever meaningfully serve God? I am not quite clear, Socrates says to Euthyphro, about the thing which you call service. I suppose you do not mean the sort of care we give to other things. The service of God is not like that, the sort of thing that we have in mind when we assert that it is not everybody who knows how to care for horses. End quote. Euthyphro, of course, can only agree. The service of God must indeed be radically different from anything as mundane as veterinary care. At the same time, Euthyphro has difficulty seeing any grounds on which he could deny the general claim that care is given for the good and the welfare of the object that is served. The problem is that subscribing to this general principle seems to bring with it an absurd result. If holiness is the service of God, and if service aims to benefit its object, then it seems to follow that, quote, when you do a holy thing, you make some deity better. This is an implication that Euthyphro emphatically rejects. Yet it's easy for Socrates to press the point. It seems obvious that the practice of worship includes such things as sacrifice and prayer. So much, at any rate, Euthyphro concedes. But if sacrifice is properly described as giving to the gods, and prayer as asking them to give, then worship is, as Socrates alleges, a mutual art of commerce between God and man. This, though, makes it impossible to avoid the question that Socrates poses, namely, what advantage could come to God from the gifts which he receives from us? Everybody sees what he gives us. Every good that we possess is given by him. What advantage can he gain by what he gets from us? Have we so much the better of him in this commerce that we get all the good things and he gets nothing from us? Are you suggesting, a horrified Euthyphro asks, that God gains anything by what he gets from us? And yet if he does not, Socrates responds, we're at a loss to explain the meaning of the gifts we offer him. The dialogue doesn't quite end there. Euthyphro asserts that worship is not beneficial to God, but it is nevertheless pleasing. And this claim simply returns the debate to the earlier dilemma. Are acts of worship good only because they please God and not because they have any intrinsic value in themselves? If that is indeed the case, then anything that pleases will be a fit form of worship. Satanic practices will be as good as angelic ones, provided only that God is pleased by them. Accepting this horn of the dilemma, however, implies that there need be nothing worshipful about God. So why go in for divine service at all? The problem Plato here identifies is a real one. What is it that we give God when we give him thanks and praise, which, as the ancient Sursum Corda says, it is a right and a good and a joyful thing always and everywhere to do. What does God get from our praises? Euthyphro is surely correct in rejecting the idea that God gets anything. Since God is the sum of all perfections, he can lack nothing. Consequently, he cannot lack anything that we might give him. But if God gets nothing from our worship, what's the point of engaging in it? And wherein lies the obligation to engage in it? On the other hand, Socrates is surely also correct in his contention that we must have commerce with God. A one-way transaction wouldn't constitute anything properly called a relationship. If we are the sole beneficiaries, we can no more enjoy a relationship with God than we can with the air we breathe. Music plays a large part in the practice of giving God thanks and praise. To question the intelligibility of worship is thus to question the intelligibility of sacred music. To ask, what does God get from our music making, is just to make a specific application of a more general question, and it thus presents us with no less troublesome a problem. Indeed, it might be thought to be more troublesome. Some historical conceptions of what rightful worship includes fall very evidently foul of Socrates' challenge, but they are relatively easy to abandon. There is, after all, biblical precedent for doing so. Your countless sacrifices, what are they to me? Isaiah hears God declare. I have no desire for the blood of bulls, of sheep and he-goats, when you come into my presence. Who has asked you for all this? Who indeed? In pointed contrast to these barbarous practices, the Christian tradition of sacred music seems gloriously edifying, something that takes us into spiritual realms far removed from the blood and gore of ritually slaughtered animals. If the music of Bach cannot be an adequate vehicle of divine worship, what could possibly serve this function? Nothing, it seems safe to say. Perhaps we can approach the issue by asking what it is that anyone gets from music. Human responses to music might enable us to say something about God's response. What does an audience get from music? It is tempting to regard this as a quasi-empirical question, one that turns on the observed effect of music on listeners. But this cannot be quite right. While it is true that in matters of programming, say, the expectations and reactions of audiences are of considerable importance, there has to be more to the matter than this. Though we may need to know what kind of music people want to hear, we also need to know which music is most worth hearing. This second requirement, however, must have a different kind of resolution. To be able to identify the best in music, we have to have some understanding of what it makes sense to expect from music. And to get this right requires us to have some conception of the nature of music. And this is a philosophical question, not an empirical one. What should we expect music at its best to give us? It's widely supposed that there is an obvious answer to this question. Music provides us with profound emotional experiences. It does so because, the same supposition goes on, its distinctive function is the communication of emotion. It's important to see the force of communication here. Music can have quite contingent emotional effects, and these can no more count as communication than angering someone could be called communicating anger. Similarly, the power of a national anthem to arouse patriotic feeling depends on its being heard by those whose anthem it is. The music in this case does not communicate emotion, it simply triggers it. And as this example suggests, music can have contrary emotional effects. The very same anthem that arouses pride in the hearts of some might engender fear in the hearts of others. So it's the communication and not merely the causing of emotion that matters. I shall call the idea that emotion is essential to music expressivism. The basic idea is that composers deliberately invest music with emotions that they use their mastery of this distinctive medium to convey. Though it is a recognizable view in philosophical aesthetics, it also strongly influenced the composition of music in the Romantic era. Indeed, it is the existence of so much wonderful music created under this influence that explains Expressivism's continuing plausibility. Who could listen to Schubert, Tchaikovsky, or Mahler and fail to think in terms of emotional experience? Yet an earlier period found an alternative answer equally persuasive, and one that has never entirely lost its plausibility. This alternative view may be called Representationism, a conception of music that regards it as a distinctive medium for the communication of thoughts and ideas rather than feelings. It's this conception of music that underlies Beethoven's ambitious contention that, quote, music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy, end quote. A higher revelation because, perhaps, it communicates thoughts too definite for words, as Felix Mendelssohn held. It's easy to see how both expressivism and representationism, in their different ways, might be called upon to forge the connection between art and faith that sacred music seems to require. For those to whom the heart of religious faith lies in an emotional response to the sacred, the effective communication and expression of that emotional response will have evident importance. If music has distinctive properties that allows it to serve this function, then it will have special value in religious worship. To those for whom, alternatively, faith is the apprehension and affirmation of deep theological truths, the idea that music is a form of revelation has obvious appeal. J.S. Bach's sacred music, it has sometimes been claimed, is especially remarkable in this respect because its harmonic structure is to be interpreted as embodying theological doctrines, notably the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Plausible though these suggestions may be, the extent to which expressivism and representationism about music in general can be applied to the use of music in worship is a debatable matter. But this is not the most critical issue. The main question concerns their philosophical adequacy. For if they are defective as philosophies of music, they're equally defective as philosophies of sacred music. How well do they fare on this score? It's relatively easy to point to a number of obvious difficulties. At the heart of expressivism lies the contention that musical composition originates in an experience of emotion which the music then evokes in those who listen to it. Now, how should we treat this claim about the origins of music? If it is an empirical generalization, then we simply lack sufficient evidence, since the psychological circumstances under which the vast majority of music was composed is unknown. If, instead, it is supposed to be a necessary truth about music, then it amounts to no more than a dogmatic claim that asserts what it ought to show. Even if, in some way, this generalization about composers could be sustained, there seems no reason to accede to the second claim about the audience. Why should we suppose that the communication of emotion requires that it be invoked or provoked? I can understand from the things that someone tells me that they are grief-stricken, and my understanding of this explains why I can sympathize with them in their grief. But this successful communication of emotion does not require that I grieve myself. And then there is this further point. If music is indeed the communication of emotion from composer to listener, it has to be regarded as a rather limited form of communication, because the range of emotions that music is commonly thought to express and elicit is very small. Joy, sadness, and excitement are plausible candidates, but there is nothing much beyond them. Does anyone think that music can evoke jealousy, envy, shame, or embarrassment? There's a fine article published a few years ago with the wonderful title, Why Music Has No Shame. Representationism about music does not fare much better. Just what a piece of music says turns out to be highly elusive once any connection with words is severed. It is no accident that in his once famous book, The Language of Music, Derek Cook rests his case for music as a language entirely on examples of musical phrases accompanying words. Without words, it seems impossible to disambiguate alternative meanings. Even if we can plausibly interpret some compositions as having semantic content, that is to say, as representing scenes, objects, or people, there is no obvious equivalent of the syntax by which this semantic content can be given different meanings. Nicholas Walterstorff contends that, quote, there is probably no better way to apprehend the character of angels than to listen with care to Messiaen's Les Anges. But even if this is true, the music can't tell us whether or not to believe in the existence of these angels. Indeed, it might be that the music was intended to assert the impossibility of their existence. Intended. Now, these remarks are no more than a brief indication of a few of the philosophical problems that confront expressivism and representation in music. Taken together with a good many others, I believe them to be insurmountable, but there is not the space here to consider the arguments fully, and nor indeed would it be entirely germane to do so. Instead, I shall just focus on just two objections that apply equally to both conceptions. The first of these was famously articulated by Edvard Hanslick in his 19th century classic, On the Musically Beautiful. Quote, whoever wants to learn about the objective nature of music, Hanslick writes on the opening page, wants to get out from under the dubious authority of feeling. Hanslick thinks that what I have called expressivism and representation about music are commonly intertwined. The first claims that the aim of music is to arouse feeling, while the second claims that it is feeling that music chiefly represents. The difference, however, is not ultimately a significant one because they both founder on the same mistake. They attribute non-musical content to music and thereby necessarily fail to do justice to its being music. In affirming the general truth that, quote, every art has as its goal the externalization of an idea actively emerging in the artist's imagination, close quote, they fail to see that, quote again, in the case of music, this idea is a tonal idea, not a conceptual idea translated into tones, end quote. Nor, we might add, is it an emotional experience translated into tones. Quote Hanslick again, the material out of which a composer creates is the entire system of tones with their latent possibilities for melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic variety. The content of music is tonally moving forms, close quote. Hanslick's principal contention is that the content of music is music. This might sound like an empty platitude, but its utter obviousness is in fact its strength. Expressivism and representationism, in their different ways, look for the significance and value of music beyond the music, in the emotional state of the composer and or audience, or in the revelatory ideas represented, whether the ideas are representations of emotion or of something else. May I just say in passing, those of you who go to concerts, just take a look at almost any program notes and you will see that representationism or expressivism are alive and well and living in the lives of those who write program notes. It seems that people who write these things, and I think this is a deep impulse in our thinking about music, they cannot be content with the music. They have to point to biographical aspects of the psychological life of the composer, the impact or the circumstances or the ideas, something. And this is the kind of thing that drove Hanslick to a fury, the determination to find non-musical, or start that sentence, to find the significance of music in non-musical content. But of course, if that were true, we could drop the music. If the ultimate meaning of music is non-musical, then it can in principle be represented to us in some other medium, words or pictures or gestures perhaps. In that case, though, the meaning of music can be accessed without actually listening to music. For Hanslick, this is an absurd conclusion, as I think it must be for anyone. Just consider the example of Mussorgsky's pictures as an exhibition. Now, Mussorgsky thought he was giving sonic versions of the pictures, but if he was, then we have a choice. We can either look at the pictures or listen to the music. But if these are equivalent, then we needn't listen to the music. And that's a reductio ad absurdum of any explanation of the value of music. The concepts of emotional experience and revelatory wisdom are invoked by expressivism and representationism to explain the value and significance that we find in music and to explicate the sense in which we can speak of music's profundity. If Hanslick's rejection of all such appeals is warranted, how then are these things to be explained? At one level, there is no explanation. Human interest in the system of musical tones, with its amazing possibilities for melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic invention, is just a given, Hanslick thinks. At another level, though, there is an explanation. The value of music lies in its unique ability to create beautiful sound, a form of beauty that is available nowhere else. So here is Hanslick at a slightly greater length. Art should not slavishly imitate nature. It has to transform it. The painter is moved to artistic representation by the occasion of encountering a delightful landscape, a group of people. The poet by an historical event or a personal experience. But what is there in nature that a composer could point to and exclaim, what a splendid prototype for an overture or a symphony? The composer cannot transform anything. He must create everything new, which has no counterpart in nature, and hence none in the other arts, indeed none in this world. Even the purest phenomenon of the natural auditory world, namely birdsong, stands in no relation to human music. Birds, strictly, do not sing. Actually, not everybody has believed, not every distinguished musician has believed this. Of course, Messiaen famously went to the trouble of going to the South Pacific to hear a particular bird so that he could incorporate it, so he said, incorporate it in his music. But I'm with Hanslick on this, actually. Birds don't sing. It's a nice noise, but it's not a song. Quite a nice noise, depends on the bird. I shall call the view that Hanslick is expounding here formalism. By this account, music, properly so called, is pure form. It is neither expressive nor representational content. Derek Cook, whom I mentioned earlier, voices a common objection to formalism when he writes that, quote, by regarding form as an end in itself instead of a means of expression, we make evaluations of composers' achievements largely irrelevant and meaningless. But it seems to me that underlying this objection is the supposition that what is purely formal is necessarily contentless in the sense of empty. but this is false. The formalist contention is that music's form is its content. Or perhaps it would be better to say that while form and content are distinguishable in music, they cannot be separated. It is natural and in no way improper to describe some musical sounds in non-formal terms. A sad chord, a jaunty melody, a bright sound. Yet the only way to specify the precise content of a piece of music is in formal terms. The melodic intervals, the chord sequence, rhythm modulations of key, instrumental timbre, and so on. It is in such terms that we analyze and identify musical forms. These forms exist as music, however, only insofar as they are filled with tonal content. A G minor chord is a harmonic structure distinguishable from its tonal content, but the tonal content is nevertheless inseparable from the structure because, arranged in a different structure, the tonal content necessarily sounds different. So you play a chord, and I tell you what it is, that's the structure, you hear it. If I change the chord, then it's a different structure, but the content necessarily is different. You hear something different. So in that sense, I can distinguish between form and content, but they are inseparable. That's obviously not true in books and prose and so on, where you can specify the content in a different form and give the same content. And actually, just a very simple example, in the visual arts, you take a portrait and you take a photograph of the portrait, or even a photograph of the person portrayed in the portrait, then you have a different form but the same content. So there's not a necessary change of content when the form changes. Now, this very brief consideration of recurrent issues in the philosophy of music can at best be expected to unsettle expressivism and representationism. Much more would need to be said before it would be reasonable to think that they had been dislodged. Actually, so firmly lodged are they in people's thinking that after teaching this stuff for many, many years, I find I never successfully dislodge expressivism, but the best I can do anywhere, I think, is just to unsettle it. However, some indication, I hope, has been given of the basis on which one might prefer a formalistic theory of music. And the main consideration operating in its favor is this, that it gives proper weight to the uniqueness of music. This uniqueness has a double aspect. Music is for listening to as nothing else is, and listening to it is ineliminable from understanding it. Since there is nothing that music stands for, there is nothing that can replace it. Though the language of emotion can be used to describe it, music is not a medium for the expression of emotion, and though it can be described as profound, it is not a medium for the revelation of ideas either. Music has no other content than itself. Hanslick is fiercely critical of any conception of music that seeks to find non-musical content in it. Yet, in a different way, he shares with those he criticizes another erroneous belief about music, namely that it is a productive art. His assumption, in general, is that just as painters produce pictures and poets produce poems, so composers produce music. To quote Hanslick again, the starting of all the creative activity of the composer is the devising of a particular melody. Through this deep-seated mysterious power, into the working of which the human eye will never penetrate, there resounds in the mind of the composer a theme, a motif. We cannot trace this first seed back to its origin. We have to simply accept it as given. Hanslick is here subscribing to a view that takes art music to be music's ideal type, and thus makes musical performances secondary to musical works. The emergence of this view over several centuries was the result of some important technical achievements and cultural developments. The historical origins of music are a matter of speculation, but it certainly existed for a great many centuries before anyone invented an effective means of writing it down. Whereas hitherto music was simply made and repeated only insofar as it was remembered, the creation of musical scores established the possibility of playing music that musicians did not improvise for themselves and had never heard previously. It was thus that the idea of a composition became possible. Since several compositions could come from a single and identifiable source, the existence and role of named composers became increasingly important. And with the rise of the concert hall, music became the object of special attention for which space and time was set aside. It's worth just noting how relatively recent this is. In a letter, Mozart famously, I shouldn't say famously, he did, Mozart complained to his father about the occasions in which he had to play the piano because they were social occasions which people chatted and didn't bother to stop and listen to the music. And Mozart plausibly thought this was a bit unfortunate. But of course it was the mode. It was only afterwards that concert halls and sitting like this, quietly listening, became somehow part and parcel of the world of music. That's relatively recent, late 18th century. With the rise of the concert hall, music became the object of special attention for which space and time was set aside, and people were attracted to attend these occasions by impresarios who advertised programs of music in advance. Their success, both commercial and artistic, then came to turn on name recognition, and the fame of individual composers grew to the point where first they equaled and then they overshadowed the fame of the performers. It's easy to see how at the end of this historical trajectory, the composer becomes the principal artist in music and the direct equivalent of the painter and the poet. Walterstorff, in Art and Action, the book I quoted earlier, both expresses and, as a matter of fact, endorses just this view. Quote, "The fundamental fact about the artist is that he or she is a worker in stone, in bronze, in clay, in paint, in acid and plates, in words, in sounds and instruments, in states of affairs. On some bit of the concrete materials of our stage, he imposes order." This belief in the fundamental unity of all the arts is widely endorsed. But in The Birth of Tragedy, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche protests against precisely this assimilation. He writes, quote, "Unlike all those who seek to infer the arts from a single principle, the necessary spring of life of every work of art," Walterstorff, of course, being a more recent instance of the kind of thing that Nietzsche has in mind. "Unlike all those who seek to infer the arts from a single principle, I shall fix my gaze on those two artistic deities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus. For me, they are the vivid and concrete representations of two worlds of art, the Apolline plastic arts and the Dionysiac music. Among the Apolline arts we may include painting, sculpture, and poetry. In each case, the artist creates an object that embodies a visual, sculptural, or literary image which the audience is invited to contemplate with interest and delight. Music and dance, by contrast, are Dionysic arts because they are not for contemplation, but for participation. In more ordinary parlance, they are performing arts. The pulsating rhythms of dance music do not invite us to stop and listen. They invite us to take to the floor. The validity of Nietzsche's distinction has been widely discussed. However we interpret it, though, Apollo and Dionysus must not be understood to symbolize the different arts in a way that allocates them to mutually exclusive categories. Many people's experience of music, after all, is Apolline. What they enjoy is listening intently to a sonic object expressly created by a named individual as something to be listened to. The audience in the concert hall seems no less engaged in contemplation than the people who stand looking at paintings in the art museum. In both instances, the object to which they give such close attention is a work originating from the imagination of an individual with a mastery of a particular medium. It is a mistake, though, to treat this Apollonian engagement with the music of the concert hall as the paradigm of musical engagement. Music is not simply written to be listened to. It is written to be played. Indeed, though the invention and widespread use of recording tends to obscure this important fact, music has to be played. I think the iPod has led people to think, to sort of wipe out the performer. You know, there's the composer, here's me, the listener, a bit of technology in between. But of course the technology only conveys, not the music, but a performance of the music. Music has to be played. A score isn't music until players literally realize it. That is to say, give it real existence as music. Without this realization, the listener would have nothing to contemplate. To this obvious, if not always evident, fact, we can add some further relevant observations. While it may be true that most music, pop as well as classical, is written to be listened to, there is nevertheless a great deal of music that is not composed for this purpose. John Philip Sousa wrote music for marching to. Johann Strauss wrote music for dancing to. That's why I think there's a limit to how much Sousa you can just listen to, and an even greater limit to the amount of Strauss you can listen to. And I might say an even better example are madrigals. Madrigals are terrific fun to sing. They are completely boring to listen to. And I say that as somebody who once conducted a madrigal group and inflicted them on audiences. I didn't realize then, but I now know that these are for singing, they're not for listening to. So there is some music, marching music and dance music, and plus madrigals, and a lot of other music that is for making, not for listening. But more importantly for, one more example, movie soundtracks are written, we might say, for being watched to. There's in the United Kingdom, there is a radio station called Classic FM, and they once a week have a special program for movie scores. I always turn it off. They're useless without the visuals. Why is that? Well, because they're written for visuals. They weren't written for the concert hall. More importantly, though, for present purposes, you may think I've lost sight of religion, but not quite. Most sacred music is not written to be listened to. Bach wrote the vast majority of his works not as concert pieces, but for use in church, a point that needs to be emphasized in a world that now mostly hears them at concerts. It is also relevant to observe that music need have neither composer nor audience, and still be a valuable enrichment of experience. Jazz musicians who improvise together follow no composition and are not playing for anyone other than themselves, yet they are undoubtedly engaged in music making. The same is to be said of sacred music. It may be true, as Waterstorff contends, that in the case of liturgical action, the importance of the accompanying music lies in the fact that, quote, it lends specificity to the action and even to the words by which the action is accomplished. But the organist who improvises during the distribution of communion may simply be filling a sacred space with spontaneously invented music that serves as a fitting oral context for a sacred ritual. Great musical skill is required for this, but to improvise with a kind of artistry that drew the attention of communicants away from the reception of the elements and into the contemplation of the music would constitute failure, not success. So the conclusion I want to draw at this stage is twofold. Following Hanslick, we may say that music is a formal rather than expressive or representational art. Following Nietzsche, we may say that it is paradigmatically a performing art. That is to say, making music is primary, while composing music and listening to it are both secondary. And this puts us in a position to return to the original question about the place of music in worship. We can address this question most satisfactorily, I shall argue, if we think of sacred music in terms of aesthetic formalism and ritual action. The opening stanza of a hymn by William Walsham Howe runs as follows: "We give thee but thine own, whate'er the gift may be. All that we have is thine alone, a trust, O Lord, from thee." These are no doubt suitably humble sentiments to sing, but they do invite the question that Socrates presses in the dialogue with which I began. If, whatever the gift we try to present, it is already God's because everything is his, what is the point of giving it? Indeed, on what grounds can we intelligibly call it a gift? To model musical artists on painters or sculptors is to think of them as people who make aesthetically valuable objects out of sonic materials. Conceived in this way, though, Plato's problem returns. Human beings may delight in their artworks, but the materials out of which they are made, and according to Walter Storff, the nature of those materials, flow from God's own creative activity. If so, then we are giving God that which he already possesses. Beautiful objects are already present in the world that God has created. Could anyone suppose that human artworks in any sense might improve upon or exceed them? Faced with this question, it is worth recalling Hanslick's contention about music, namely, the composer cannot transform anything. He must create everything new, which has no counterpart in nature, and hence none in the other arts, indeed none in this world. If this is true, composition is a uniquely pure form of creation. Though Hanslick does refer to the materials composers use, this passage seems to assert that musical composition is creation ex nihilo, from nothing. This accords, of course, with the unity of form and content by which formalists claim music is uniquely characterized. If formalism is true, then a musical offering is not giving God back his own in the reordering of pre-existent materials. Rather, it is calling something wholly new into existence. Even if this is true, however, it does not seem to resolve Socrates' problem entirely. Musical creations may be ex nihilo and not, therefore, simply the re-presentation of things that God has already given. Nevertheless, there remains the question of what makes their presentation in the context of divine worship a kind of service. How could what human beings make benefit God? This question, however, rests upon the supposition that what is made is an art object. Its focus is on an Apollonian musical work. But what if we shift the focus to a Dionysian musical performance? Here, it needs to be repeated that music exists only in performance, a truth that the invention of sound recording has hidden but has not falsified. And performance is action. A song is something we sing, and singing is something we do. Worship, too, is something we do. It is action. but it is action of a special kind, namely ritual action. The use of the term ritual here should not be understood restrictively as referring to only highly ritualistic styles of worship. Its meaning in this context is derived from a contrast with the technical and with ethical action. Technical actions are those actions whose intelligibility lies in the consequences that are supposed to flow from them. Serving food and administering painkillers are obvious examples. It is pointless to serve food that does not nourish, or administer painkillers that don't kill pain. Ethical actions are actions whose intelligibility relies on their being in accordance with moral rules. Telling the truth and keeping promises are obvious examples. The requirement to keep a promise does not derive from the prospect of future benefits, but from the implications of past actions. These are very brief and hasty remarks. Of course, utilitarians aren't going to buy that, but that's another debate. Now, ritual actions are neither of these. They're not ethical and they're not technical. They do not flow from past commitments, nor do they look to future consequences. Rather, their meaning derives from the structuring symbols they invoke. A simple example of this is the practice of pledging allegiance to the flag. And though it can be laid down as a rule that the Pledge of Allegiance must be said each morning, failure to observe this rule would not qualify as immoral behavior. In short, pledging allegiance is a ritual act. Like the British military's last post, a bugle call that signals the end of the day, it does not bring about consequences in time, nor does it flow from any fundamental moral principle by which human interaction needs to be governed. Rather, it structures the time and the space within which these consequences and interactions take place. It helps give meaning to the otherwise meaningless flow of time and to the organization of otherwise undifferentiated space. Ritual acts, such as the Pledge of Allegiance and the last post, generate meaning through the use of symbols that are drawn from and related to important aspects of human life. In both these cases, the identification of political communities and their maintenance. Viewed in this light, the worship of God is ritual action par excellence. There is not space here to do more than assert this contention, but the thought underlying it is one that Schleiermacher articulates at length in his speeches on religion, speeches to its cultured despisers, a very fine title. In those speeches, he claims that the purpose of religion is, quote, to relate us and our appearance directly to the universe. Characteristically, worship takes the natural structures of human time, birth, maturity, and death, and the natural structures of space, habitat, home, and nation, and it relates them to the imponderable vastness of cosmos and eternity. Schleiermacher's reflections on religion give us a context in which philosophical formalism appears to be the best explanation of music's peculiar value as a mode of worship. If, as Hanslick alleges, music has no counterpart in nature or this world, and if, as I have argued, the reality of music lies in its being brought into existence ex nihilo by enactment, then it provides us with a mode of activity that transcends this world. On this account, music is not action aimed at presenting God with something by which he might be benefited, or with which he might be pleased. Rather, it is action within the life of God, which is to say, action that both takes place in time and space and is beyond time and space action that enables us, in Schleiermacher's phrase, to be eternal in a moment. These remarks are, to say the least, very sketchy. The conceptions of God and music towards which they gesture could be filled out at greater length, of course, and would, I think, become more plausible. However, even with this elaboration were to be supplied, one hugely important topic would remain to be addressed. A great deal of sacred music, probably the vast majority of it, is music with words. Hanslick is clear that his arguments are reflections on the nature of instrumental music. Despite widespread opinion to the contrary, words and music, he claims, have no special affinity with each other. They comprise an essentially morganatic marriage, as he says, with words functioning as a decidedly inferior party. It is not at all easy to see that this could be said of hymns and anthems. From a religious point of view, the words would seem to be certainly no less and possibly more important than the music to which they are set. How are the texts of sacred music to be fitted into the account of music given here? This is a good and I think a very difficult question, but it is one for another occasion. Thank you very much.